I've got 9 o'clock, so if Miss Glenda will sit down, we'll get started. Didn't I say that last week too? All right. We've got a lot of material to cover, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. I've asked Jeremy if he would to lead us in prayer to start us off. So we'll give people a second to kind of get settled, and then he'll lead a prayer. It's good to have everybody here today. While we're waiting, does anybody have any prayer requests that were not in the bulletin or have already kind of been mentioned? All right, it's good to see Scott and his mom and dad here. All right.
Father, we thank you for another opportunity to come together with family, with your word. Pray that you fill us with that mindset in a way that will take change through our life. So that one day we'll have a home in heaven. Father, we thank you for the gift of life, for your sacrifice, for the gift that makes it possible for everyone. Father, show us the congregation to reach out to those here in the community and around the world who are searching for the truth, who are in need of the gospel. Help us to pray, seek, everywhere we have opportunity.
Appreciate it. Well, so as I mentioned, we've got a lot of material to cover, a lot of things that I kind of want to point out about this set of Scripture and about Hezekiah. Last week we talked about Hezekiah, and we talked about Judah alone and the things that were accompanied with that. I started off by mentioning some real-world archaeological things that have been found. I mentioned that the seals of Hoshea, Hezekiah, as well as Uzziah were found, and it was the royal court seals that have been found. So that lends credence to the discussions that we have. What's interesting is that Cherub, he kept some pretty detailed annals, so they also help solidify the things that we're talking about. But there's also some other finds that I'd like to share with you. The first one is the Lachish reliefs. And if you've read this story at all, you see the city of Lachish. But the Lachish reliefs were found in the ruins of the Nineveh palace of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. And these reliefs are 62 foot long. And they describe the fall of the Judean fortress of Lachish. It was kind of a wish that this would happen. But this relief was found, this 62-foot relief that depicted the fall of the Judean fortress at Lachish. There's also something called the Sennacherib Prism, and it's not like you imagine as far as it's not a glass prism that light would shine through or anything, but it's a prism that is 15 inches tall, and it's a 6-sided prism. But the important part about that is it's a baked clay item, and it tells the story of the Judea invasion, and it was found in Nineveh as well. So Nineveh was a real city. I mean, we know this from Jonah and some other things, but it was a real city. We need to remember that these things actually happened, and it's backed up by secular documentation as well. Further, the Prism says that the Assyrians trapped Hezekiah, quote, like a bird in a cage. But it never mentions anything about them actually conquering Jerusalem. And that's an important fact, because the annals that he had boasted that there were 5 more campaigns after the attempt at Jerusalem. It also mentions 46 different Judean cities, the fortified cities and things that were taken, but never Jerusalem. And that's because, spoiler alert, that's because God said that He wasn't going to let Jerusalem fall. So a very important piece for us to remember as we go through this. Something I mentioned last week as well is that Isaiah was one of the prophets that was critical to Hezekiah and the things that his rule. He heavily relied on Isaiah. Isaiah had been doing his thing for about 40 years already. So the fact that Hezekiah relied on him, he must have understood that the things that Isaiah was saying had come to fruition several times. He was a man of God, so he relied on him heavily. So with that in mind, a good resource, and we'll go to it a couple of times as we get to it, Isaiah 36 through 39, those chapters really encompass what we're talking about as far as Hezekiah and his rule. So important factors here, one from the secular view that confirm the things that we're talking about in Kings and Chronicles, but also from a religious point of view with regards to the harmony of the books that we have, particularly here Isaiah itself. All right, so just starting off real quick, number one, a recap of, we start off with a recap of the fall of Samaria. It occurs in 2 Kings 18, 9 through 12. But question number one, Samaria was besieged by Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, for how long? How long did he besiege? 3 years. Okay, so we know that from Hosea, the discussion there. I think we talked about it last week as well. But what year of Hezekiah's reign did it begin? Scott, I don't have this printed off, so I apologize. But 2 Kings 18 will be in 2 Kings 18, also in 2 Chronicles 32. I don't know that any made it onto the wall. I think I heard it. The 4th year of Hezekiah is when this siege started, but what was the final year that it happened during his reign? When did it end? You're absolutely right. The 6th year of Hezekiah's reign. So 4th, 5th, and 6th, 3 years by their counting, right? So 3 years is how long that siege happened. Israel was carried captive and scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire for what reason? They turned from God? Anything else? Huh? To weaken them? Okay. All right. So the primary reasons were they did not obey the voice of God. Okay. Like Kevin mentioned, they transgressed their covenant, but they also transgressed all that Moses had commanded. And that's interesting because we didn't get to it last week, but they were worshiping something called the Nehushtan, and it literally means bronze thing. They had taken Moses' serpent and made a bronze thing. That way they could burn incense to it. We didn't get to cover it last week. It was kind of at the end of our topic that we didn't get to, but it's interesting to counter what Hezekiah, or it was interesting how Hezekiah countered that, that the Israelites were carried off into captivity because they were worshiping this thing that was inspired by Moses, the bronze serpent. They had taken and turned that into an idol, but yet Hezekiah is now doing those things that Moses had actually commanded. So you see that difference between what Israel was doing and what Judah was doing. So I think that was, I found that interesting and kind of a counterpoint. Here the Israelites were worshiping this golden idol, or this bronze idol rather, in the shape of Moses' serpent. What Hezekiah did with that serpent was he destroyed it. So when he was tearing down the high places, all these altars and things, he destroyed this bronze serpent to get rid of it completely. And that was a show to the people. If he had kept that around for posterity or for, just interest, they could have easily turned back to it. But he destroyed it completely. And I think that's an interesting thing. All right. Who invaded Judea during the reign of Hezekiah? I think we've kind of already answered that. Cherub, the king of Assyria. So moving on to number 3, what tribute did Hezekiah give to the king of Assyria? 1 Kings 18, 14 through 16. All right. He said 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Anything else? All the silver out of the Lord's house. Anything else? All the treasure in the king's house. Anything else? Gold from the doors and the pillars as well in the house of the Lord. So he gave quite a bit. I wanted to call your attention to 18:14, not the year, but the chapter and verse. Chapter 18 and verse 14. It says, "Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Turn away from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will pay. And the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judea, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold." I could have stopped earlier because my point, the reason I wanted to bring that up is, does anybody have anything different? The first thing he said is, I have done wrong. Does anybody have a different translation of that? I have offended, that's the American Standard? King James? Okay. American Standard has offended as well, I believe. Anything else? All right. The one I'm trying to get to is the literal translation. If you look at the literal translation, it says, I have sinned. So Hezekiah tells the king of Assyria, I have sinned. And therefore, I feel like I owe you this payment. And so that's the literal translation of it, which it's interesting because Hezekiah was very much a God-fearing person. But he tells this king that I have sinned against you, essentially. All right. What defenses did Hezekiah make? 2 Chronicles 32, 2 through 6. What were some of the things that he did? Let me stop that question. Let me ask you a different question. Before he did it, what did he do as he planned for this? That's a bonus question, I think. He prepared. How did he prepare? Do you recall what was the first thing he did? He consulted with his leaders. And that was something that Hezekiah regularly did. He was a very God-fearing man, so he prayed regularly. We'll see where he went straight to God on several occasions, or we have seen where he goes straight to God on several occasions. Particularly later when we talk about his illness, the first thing he does is pray to God. So he was a praying man. But he also consulted with his leaders regularly. We see that in a couple of instances already. We've seen that in a couple of instances already where he consulted with his leadership first. So what did they collectively decide to do to defend the city of Jerusalem? They stopped up the water supply. Why did they stop up the water supply? Yeah, because, if we can't use it inside our own house, our own city, I'm sure not going to let the Assyrian army have it and have ease of access to water. They're going to have to go search for it themselves. So he stopped up this water supply, the springs outside the city, in order to keep the Assyrians from having it. Now, it says there something that it may not be immediately clear, but it says that he strengthened himself. And I think that's an important part of the defense of this city, because he was the ruler. He was the one that all of these people are looking to for strength and guidance. If his foundation is not solid, then everything could fall apart. So he strengthened himself. I think that's a critical part of the defense of the city. And then he built up the broken wall. Presumably that's probably up on the northwest side of the city, because that was the side that the army went to. So he built up that broken wall. He built another wall outside of that wall. So now he's doubled the defenses. And he has also repaired the Milo. Does anybody know what the Milo is? It's not the Venice, the Milo. The landfill. So there is a landfill outside the city, and from what I can tell, it's kind of a terraced hill outside the city that they took the refuse and the rubbish and things outside the city. The reason they did the terracing was to maximize the land space, I guess, is kind of the thought that historians, archaeologists believe. But it's literally landfill. So interesting that he repaired it in order to be able to use it more effectively, I guess, or whatever the case may be. But it was mentioned, so it's important. He also made weapons and shields in abundance. Now, here's something that jumps out at me. He set military commanders or captains over the people. That's important because now we're kind of getting into a not necessarily a martial law situation, but it's a situation that the people know that things are getting serious here. And here are men that have been trained in order to protect or defend or even maybe train these people in order to defend themselves as well. So he put the captains over the people. One final thing, I mentioned he strengthened himself. The next thing he did was he gathered the people in the open square of the court in order to strengthen them and encourage them as well. So all these pieces, he strengthened himself to begin with, and the final piece was he was encouraging and strengthening the people by saying, look at all the things that we've done to prepare for this expected siege. Now, I want to jump ahead to the last page, the very last part of that. It says in there, question 8 on the last page, it says, what engineering feat did Hezekiah achieve? And I wanted to talk about it here because I think it's important, even though it's mentioned at the end of this section here with Hezekiah. But what engineering feat did he achieve? We've already kind of covered it. He stopped up the springs, but what did he do with that water? All right. So he made the pool of Siloam, and then he diverted the water to this pool. Now, the author here, it talks about the excavation of a 1,750-foot tunnel under Jerusalem. Now, if you Google it and look, it's a winding path, and it's very interesting, this story here, because I don't want to bring it up. I started kind of getting nerdy because I like the history of things, and so in 1880, this tunnel was known about, but they had not found an inscription in it or anything like that. I mean, they had a pretty good idea of what it was for and the historical evidence, but here it's known as Hezekiah's Tunnel. It diverted water from the Gihon Spring on the eastern slope of the city, and it brought it to the Siloam pool on the western part of the city. I mentioned it's a winding path, but part of the reason that it's winding is, here's the inscription that two young boys found. They were wading in the water in the southern part of the tunnel, and they just happened upon this inscription. And the inscription says, this is the record of how the tunnel was breached. While the excavators were wielding their pickaxes, each man towards his co-worker, and while there were yet 3 cubits for the breach, a voice was heard, each man calling to his co-worker, because there was a cavity in the rock extending from the south to the north. So they started at both ends, and they started working towards each other. So now they're 3 cubits from each other, and they start hearing their voice on each side. So that's kind of an engineering feat. I mean, I can't do that today with today's technology, much less, what they're doing going through solid rock. And then it continues, it says, so on the day of the breach, the excavators struck each man to meet his co-worker, pickaxe against pickaxe. Then the water flowed from the spring to the pool, a distance of 1,200 cubits. 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the heads of the excavators. So here's this inscription that these two boys find in 1880 talking about how this tunnel that Hezekiah commissioned to be built, it's very interesting to me. And it's one more evidence of the fact that this is a true story. These are the things that happened. And it was built for this expected siege of Jerusalem. So going back to page 1, I wanted to take that little detour, that path down my rabbit hole there, but I think it's important. All right, number 5. It says, "Why were the people not to be afraid?" And that's Chronicles 32, 7 and 8. All right, the Lord was with them. Anything else? They have more soldiers, did they? That's what it says. Later we'll see just how many that the angel of the Lord killed in the Assyrian army. But I can assure you, Jerusalem did not have more than the Assyrian army. So it says in there that he says that there are more of us than with him. Wow. Let's turn to 2 Kings 6. Remind ourselves of a story that we've already covered here. 2 Kings 6. If somebody would read 14 through 17 here.
Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God rose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? So he answered, Do not fear, for those who are with us more than those who are with them. And Elijah prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elijah.
All right. So, if you don't think that Hezekiah knew this story, you're probably not paying attention. Hezekiah knew the history. Now, was he saying that Isaiah in his day was going to breed in this army of fiery chariots and horses? I don't think that's what he's saying. But what he did say, he said, with him is an army of flesh, talking about the Assyrian king. But with us is the Lord. So he had a reliance on the Lord. He had seen the Lord come through on so many occasions, and he had faith in that. So he may not have been thinking that there was an army of fiery horses and chariots, but he knew that God was going to provide. Yes, sir. Right. So Jeremy, I'll do a quick synopsis. He's mentioning about Joshua and how Joshua was encouraged in similar language as he was going across. And the things that were said to him to encourage him and make him strengthened to know that he shouldn't be afraid as well. All right. Whom did the king of Syria send to Jerusalem? And what message did they deliver to Hezekiah's servants? Sure. So 3 names. I've got Tartan. And then there's 2 R words, Rabsaris and Rabshakeh, I guess. We'll go with that. But these are titles of some sort, possibly meaning the first one possibly commander-in-chief, the next one possibly chief officer, and the next one possibly chief of staff. That's just something that's written in this commentary. But the point is, you see that there's a order of these individuals, and they have some high-ranking titles, and that's why they're there, to deliver this. As a sidebar, do you know where they showed up? Where they appeared? It's mentioned there, some field. Fuller's Field. And that's on that northwest corner of the city that I was talking about a minute ago. So presumably that's where the broken down wall was, and that would be the most, the expected easiest spot to breach the city if necessary. Now we'll get into that in a minute. Let's go ahead and look at 18:17 through 25, and I'll read that real quick. I wanted to point this out, but in the meantime, if someone would turn to Isaiah 10, 5 through 11. Jeremy, would you mind Isaiah 10, 5 through 11? So starting in verse 17 of Kings 18, it says, Then the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh from Lachish with a great army against Jerusalem to King Hezekiah. And they went up and came to Jerusalem. When they had come up, they went and stood by the aqueduct of the upper pool, which was on the highway to the fuller's field. And when they had called to the king, Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, Shebna, the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came out to them. Then the Rabshakeh said to them, Say now to Hezekiah, Thus says the great king, the king of Assyria. Stop there. The king, great king, that was, they normally just said king unless it was a major king, one that had great lands, territories, and things. This was a title reserved for a major king, great king. So just to reiterate the king of Assyria's power. What confidence is this in which you trust? You speak of having plans and power for war, but they are mere words. And in whom do you trust, that you rebel against me? Now look, you are trusting in the staff of this broken reed, Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust him. It's interesting, stopping there, it's interesting that he uses the broken reed. That's something that Egypt's very well known for, is the reeds and their dependence on that. So him talking about a broken reed, a broken promise, a broken relationship, alliance. What happened to Hoshea when he reached out to the Egyptians? Instead of paying his fare, his tax or tribute to Assyria, he was trying to do that. He was trying to establish an alliance with this new king or pharaoh of Egypt, and that failed him. So it could be that this is why it's being mentioned here, because he is turning. There's the thought that maybe they would try to turn to Egypt, because Egypt was trying to hold their own as well. Continuing in verse 22, how far are we going? All right. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away and said to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Now therefore I urge you, well, stop there for a second. Notice that he's trying to undermine the things that Hezekiah has done. Hezekiah has absolutely done what God wanted him to do by tearing down these places. But here is this voice of the king saying, well, Hezekiah's taken away the things that you used to worship God. He is intentionally misrepresenting, I believe. I think he knew. I think he's wiser than sometimes we give them credit as far as the history and their role in history as well. And Jeremy will kind of read that here in a second. So continuing on, it says, Now therefore I urge you, give a pledge to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you're able to, on your part, to put riders on them. How then will you repel one captain of the least of my master's servants and put your trust in Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Have I now come up without the Lord against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, Go up against this land and destroy it. So we see a lot of mocking tone. We see a lot of things going on here. And the intent was to undermine the things that Hezekiah had done. The intent was to mock the reliance or the thought of alliance with Egypt. And he also mocked him about being able to find enough horses or riders for the horses. I'll give you these 2,000, but you're not going to find enough men to sit upon them. And then he goes on to mock God by telling them that God told him to come and take the city. Jeremy, go ahead and read Isaiah 10. I lost my spot. Isaiah 10, 5 through 11.
O Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in your hand is mine to be named. I will send you against a critical nation and against the people of my wrath. I will give you a charge. Take the spoil and take the prey, and to tread you down like the mighty street. Howbeit, he leadeth not still, he leadeth us apart but it is in his heart to control, and to cut off nations out of peace. For he said, are not my princes all together kings? Is not Calno as Carshena? Is not Haman as Arba? Is not Samaria as Damascus? As my hand is found in even in the islands, and in greater images with the cells of Jerusalem as slaves, shall I not as in my found in Samaria and her idols, so it is in Jerusalem and her idols.
All right. So we see there the first in verse 5 it says, "And the staff in whose hand is my indignation." So it says that Assyria, the rod of my anger. He's using Assyria. He is using Assyria in this fashion. So Assyria, I believe, is very wise to this. And they're trying to misuse prophecy, and they're trying to misuse this rod that they are for God. And they're trying to do things and use that in a way to scare these Judah. So, moving on to number 7, it says, "What request did Hezekiah's servants make to Rabshakeh?" That's 1826. All right, to speak in Aramaic and not Hebrew. Now, Aramaic had become the international language for diplomacy, for negotiations and things. So, the men of Judah may have thought, you owe that to us as far as being, if we're emissaries, that's something that should happen. Speak to us in the proper language. But that is not what Assyria is interested in. How did Rabshakeh, I'm going to say it 15 different ways, respond to this request in verses 27 through 35? Spoke in Hebrew. He said, "Yeah, I'm not going to do that." And he even spoke louder, I believe, because he's now talking to the people. He's wanting the people to hear the things that they're saying. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read that section, but I encourage you to read it later. The things that he's trying to do, but this was a common tactic that the Assyrians used. They tried to undermine. They tried to talk in the common language of the people. That way they heard it. It didn't give the opportunity for the king to rebut those things that this person is saying. And they're trying to, it's a scare tactic. Okay? And how much easier would their job be, the Assyrian army be, if the people were to rebel against their king? I mean, their work is done now, right? So they're trying to get the people to rebel against Hezekiah by calling out these things and misrepresenting all these facts, right? And notice one of the things that he keeps reiterating is numbers. The power that they have, the number of men, the number of horses, the number of chariots, the number of weapons, the number. It's always about the number. And he's trying to defeat them without having to fire a shot, basically, because he's trying to scare them into submission. Let's also look at Isaiah 30. Turn to Isaiah 30. I wanted to point out something that Isaiah warned has already given warning of this. Isaiah 30, talking about Egypt, Isaiah 30 verses 3 through 5, it says, "Therefore the strength of Pharaoh shall be your shame, and trust in the shadow of Egypt shall be your humiliation. For his princes were at Zoan, and his ambassadors came to Hanes. They were all ashamed of the people who could not benefit them, or be help or benefit, but a shame and also a reproach." Then flip over one chapter to 31, starting in verse 1. "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. Yet he is also wise and will bring disaster, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of evildoers and against the help of those who work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who helped will fall down. They will all perish together." So that's a very interesting warning that Isaiah gives about that. And when we look back at Hosea and the fact that he reached out to Egypt and tried to align himself, he should have been paying attention to Isaiah. He was warned. Hezekiah is taking that to heart, and he's not doing that. But the Assyrians are trying to put that little nugget of doubt in the people of Judah. So all intertwined and all interworking, and I think we need to be sure to, and I know we ain't even got off page 1 here. How much time we got? All right, we got plenty of time. All right, so how did the people respond, and what did Hezekiah's servants do? They held their peace and kept silence as their king had instructed them to do. What did the servants do? You're right. They rent their clothes and went to the king and told him all the things that the emissaries had told them to do. So they rent their clothes. Now, when you first read through this, my thought was, are these ambassadors for Hezekiah saying, speak in Aramaic? That way the people can't hear what's being said, and maybe we can work some thing out for our own benefit. No, that's not the case. This shows that they were distraught by these words. They weren't trying to undermine Hezekiah's rule by having these emissaries talk in Aramaic so they can make some kind of thing, backdoor alliance that the people wouldn't be aware of. They went and told Hezekiah with rent clothes. They were fully behind him, and they were distraught as well. So when Hezekiah received the message, to whom did he appeal? All right, God. Where did he go to do that? House of the Lord. Okay? So the first thing he did was turn to God again. We talked about he was a praying man. He goes to God first with these things. He went to the house of the Lord to be even closer, right? We'll see it later if we get to it, where he took the letter that Cherub sent him to the house of the Lord. God knew what was on that letter, but he took it as a example, or here, God, I'm giving it to you. It was a kind of a symbolic thing, I suppose. But he was a praying man. Now, what was the next thing he did, though? Who else did he turn to? We just read from his book. Isaiah. All right, so he sent his servants to Isaiah saying, hey, need some help here. Can you come and help us out? We've got a situation. I need some good guidance. All right. What prophecy did Isaiah speak against the Assyrians? Let's just go ahead and read 19, Kings 19, verses 6 and 7, just very quickly. And Isaiah said to them, thus you shall say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid of the words which you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Surely I will send a spirit upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. All right, we're not going to get to that last question, but I'll just go ahead and tell you. His two sons, Cherub is forced, or hears a rumor, and he returns to his own city. He's in his holy place, as it were, worshiping his idol, his God, and his two sons kill him by the sword. It doesn't happen for 20 years, but it happened, as God promised. And then a little more history. The third son took over and reigned in his stead. So the two sons came along and killed him while he's worshiping this God, which interestingly enough did not warn him that he was about to die. He did nothing for him because he was a fake God. He was not a living God. So it's interesting, I think, that happened. So God's promise here through Isaiah that the king would be slain by the sword it came to fruition. All right. When Hezekiah received a letter from Sennacherib, he went to the house of the Lord and prayed. Describe his prayer. And I'm just going to give you the answer. He talked about how God is the one and only God. And he said that several different ways. A few times he said that. But basically he was calling to God's mind that they felt God was the only God there was. And he was, I don't know, I don't want to say it like this because I don't think it's the right words, but I'm stumbling. He was tickling God's ears. God wants to hear those things from us. What's the right word, Jeremy? Fervent, effectual prayer. There you go. I guess that's perfect words. So he was acknowledging that God is a jealous God. He wants to know that we rely on Him solely, and that is what Hezekiah is saying. You alone, God, are the one that we're relying on. And if you're interested, Isaiah 37, 1 through 7 mirrors this part of the story here almost verbatim, and it has a little bit of other clues there as well. So continuing on, 13a, it says, why was Sennacherib despised and scorned by the daughter of Zion? I mean, there's a list of reasons. Namely, he reproached and blasphemed God, right? He also raised his voice against God. This was not a humble person. This was a man that felt that he was a God himself. And he is going up against God, and he felt bold enough to raise his own voice to God. He also lifted his eyes on high. So he's bold. He has reason to be. Yes, sir. Yeah. Fear. Jeremy says people do that even today, where they don't fear God. They have no reason to fear God because they believe they have no reason to fear because to them God is not real. And here's this king who has great wealth, numerous armies, numerous successes in the battlefield, numerous campaigns. He has reason to believe in his mind that he is powerful, that he is as great as a God. So, describe Sennacherib's boasting. Why had he been successful militarily? Well, we covered this already. He has the numbers. It's always about the numbers with him, and he reiterates that. And many of these places that he's conquered, he hasn't necessarily had to fight for them because the people have just capitulated. They saw the numbers that he had. And reference what message he had sent to Hezekiah earlier, he basically said, can you seriously stand against me? You really think you can? I mean, it was almost that mocking tone. You can't stand against my army. I mean, I've defeated greater peoples than you as far as numerically. But he forgot about God. What would the Lord do to Sennacherib? What did he say he would do? In 19, 27, and 28. what would he put in his nose? A hook and a bridle in his lip, and he would turn him back to where he came from. And we see that that's the case. It appears that he even took the same path back through the same valleys and the same, to the same place. And I'll give you a sidebar. My granddad used to tell me, you never come back the same way you went because somebody might be laying in wait. And these armies took that to heart. I mean, that was something that they actually tried not to do, was they normally didn't go back the way that they came because people could be laying in wait. I appreciate your attention. This was my last teaching. Next month it'll be, who's teaching up here? I can't remember. Yeah, you're doing Wednesday. Anyway, David Day, he's teaching. Thank you. I encourage you to read through here. There's a lot of interesting stuff that we did not get to, but unless y'all want to just hang out for another 30 minutes.